Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Good morning once again. We take this opportunity to introduce ourselves to each other. My name is Howard.
Doug, Jim,
Mike.
Greg. George. Snake.
Eunice,
Todd. Kay.
Carl, Randy,
John. Charles. Peter.
Seth,
Karen.
David.
Thomas.
Jack. John. Lee. Peter. Steve. Tim.
And my name is Roger.
Good morning, Roger. It's my privilege to introduce you to the group, well-known, well-loved, our very own Roger Corless, a.k.a. Dharma Daddy. Professor Emeritus at Duke University, author of a number of books, Buddhism, always truly a delight. We open our hearts to you and to this time.
This morning I would like to, for no particular reason, but I would like to talk about the Buddhist attitude toward other religions. I don't know quite why this came to me as a topic, but I don't think I've talked of it here before. It is an extension of chapter 5 of my book, The Vision of Buddhism, which I know some of you have. But if you've read that chapter, this won't be a repeat of it. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but there'll be a lot of new stuff. And partly also in the back, the appendix on the story of the Dharma. I had a few of these books and I've sold them all, so if there's interest, I can take orders and I can get some more in. And you get a discount if you order them from me. I think I only charge $15. It's like a $20 book. So people who have read this have given me the compliment that it reads well. In fact, some people have said, you don't sound like a professor, which I regard as a compliment. So the Buddhist attitude towards other religions is not quite the same topic as the dialogue between Buddhism and other religions, like Buddhist Christian dialogue or Buddhist Jewish dialogue, but it has something to do with that. However, I'm going to try to concentrate on how Buddhism has seen other religions. And as I thought about this, it expanded in my mind to a whole seminar, so I'm going to try to give you just a brief rundown. The main idea is to, well, first of all, to get out of our heads the notion that the structure of Buddhism is similar to the structure of Christianity. I think this is still somewhat of a problem to people because Buddhism is called a religion and Christianity is called a religion, and just because they're called religions you think they're the same, but then you see playing football and billiards and card games are all games, but they're not the same. So I think it's helpful to call Buddhism a religion if you're applying for some center because it gives you a tax break. I think that's about the only reason that I can call it. It's good, and it gives you some legal protection in the U.S. But the structure of Christianity, which sometimes we get stuck on, is unusual in religions in that it, in theory, has a boundary. In theory, it's something like a house, and people come in the house, and you can get to know the number of those in the house, and that's the number of Christians that there are. In practice, the walls of the house have never been clearly defined. In fact, no one quite knows what one means by saying a number of Christians, but still in theory it is there, and so that also means that in theory one can tell how Buddhism is different from other religions and how they measure up. The Buddhist tradition doesn't even begin to have anything like that as far as I can see. And so the model of Buddhism is more like that of the gravitational field of a planet. The closer we are to a particular planet, and let's take Earth for example, since it's the only one we really know for sure, despite Star Trek and whatever, then we are Earthlings. We're all sitting on the Earth right now, so we're all Earthlings, and there's no problem saying that we are. Then if we get into a spaceship and start moving away from the Earth, the gravitational pull of the Earth would become steadily less, and at some point it would be so negligible that we could say we're outside the gravitational pull of the Earth, although officially, mathematically we wouldn't be, but for all practical purposes we are. But we could never say there was a particular clearly defined boundary that we went over, and after that we were no longer influenced by the gravitational pull of the Earth. That somehow it just got weaker as we got further out, and the gravitational pull of other planets and stars became more important. So similarly in Buddhist tradition there is a center which is fairly clearly defined: Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Buddha, the teaching and the taught, the teacher, the teaching and the taught. And it is possible to become a monk or nun, as we say in English, and it's quite the same as they're not monks or nuns, but anyhow they look like monks and nuns. There's something different really, bhikshus and bhikshunis. And it's possible to be a devout layperson observing the precepts, and so such a person can more or less clearly say, I'm a Buddhist, though they don't always choose to say that. But then one can be further and further out, and one can practice a bit of Buddhism with a bit of other things, and at some point eventually is not really practicing Buddhism at all, but somehow you're influenced by it, especially because Buddhism, its own name for it, is not a Buddhism. I guess it is now because it's in the English-speaking world and we use this word. We like isms. We like our religions to be isms, except for Christianity, which is the only itty, I think, amongst them, and Islam, for which we tend to use now its own term. And Christianity actually is Christianisme in French, so it's only the English that wanted it to be an itty. So we have a Buddhism, but the most common word for itself is the Dharma, which can be translated as the truth, the way things are. Once again, like the law of gravity, you don't have to be a believer in Newton for the Newtonian laws to work. They're going to work anyhow. Newton was the person who discovered how the laws work, but didn't make them up, and doesn't require you to believe in Newton so that they will work. So the Buddha also didn't make these things up, and you don't have to believe in the Buddha for these things to work. Things like the law of karma, they're going to work anyhow, whether you believe in them or not. That is the Buddhist view of things. So, with that in mind, it's a quite different picture from certain religions, especially some of the more conservative Christian traditions, which tend to oppose the truth of Christianity to the falsity of other religions. There are other forms of Christianity which don't do that, which have more of a spectrum, but the ones that are the most vocal on the TV and so forth tend to talk in terms of the truth inside and evil and Satan outside. And this is, it's not even possible to begin to do this in Buddhism because there's no inside or outside. There's a center but no periphery. Having said that, however, Buddhism is not indifferent and doesn't say, well, it's whatever you like, and like especially in California, we say, well, whatever turns you on, Some people like to work at the soup kitchen, Some people go to McDonald's and shoot people. Well, it's one of those things. That is not the Buddhist view. It's not the Buddhist view. Buddhism would say the first action is good, the second action is unskillful, would be the way to put it. Not a bad or evil, but unskillful, because you're harming other beings and you're harming yourself too. Ultimately, even though you might enjoy the killing at the time, it's going to come back to you and you're going to have a lot of problems later. Buddhism is not indifferent, and it does say there is a way of doing things, just once again like the law of gravity. There is a law of gravity, and we have to abide by it, or we just can't walk around. We just keep breaking things because we put them on a shelf that isn't there, and they fall to the ground. And we say, why is that? I put them on the shelf. So we have to understand how things work. But then Buddhism tends then to say other religions or other traditions may be not as good as Buddhism, not as effective as Buddhism. Sometimes I prefer to see Buddhism as more of a therapy. I think it's especially helpful in the US to do that as a religion. It's a way of relieving suffering. And other traditions, which we may call religions or philosophies or practices, may be helpful in relieving suffering, but they may not go the whole way. They may not get to the root of the matter. That by following the teachings of the Buddha, we can go further. So I'd like now to do a little bit of a sort of historical vignettes, a series of historical vignettes on this, starting with the experience of the Buddha Shakyamuni, the Buddha for our space-time continuum. Some of you may know that I prefer not to refer to the historical Buddha, which means that Shakyamuni is historical, and then the other Buddhas are mythological. This gives a special status to history, which is not entirely warranted. History is a way of understanding reality, and so is myth. And in Buddhism, the distinction between those two is not as clear as it is in some Western traditions, because the notion of objective reality existing on its own side or for its own sake is called into question. Not that there is no objective reality, but not that everything is subjective, but objective and subjective are interdependent. So there's not a clear division between fact and then something called myth, which is in the mind or something. So I talk of the Buddha Shakyamuni as the Buddha for our space-time continuum, or for our continuum, the one that when we apply the tools of historical criticism to reality, it produces an entity which we call the Buddha, who lived in the northeast of the Indian subcontinent. Not India, please. India didn't exist at that time. India is a political reality, and that the way the boundaries are done now, are drawn today, the traditional birthplace of the Buddha is in Nepal. And you only have to say that the Buddha was an Indian in the presence of a Nepali once to learn your lesson. It's a matter of national pride that the Buddha was not one Indian, he was one Nepali, isn't it? So he lived in the Indian subcontinent in the northeast, approximately 6th century BCE. And the story is that he left. You probably know the story in general. I'm not going to give the whole story of the Buddha in this talk, but he left his wife and family in search of what was really going on in reality, in search, in fact, of the Dharma. And he'd heard about a lot of different teachers in the forest, in the jungle, the Aranya, which is takes the place in India, in the Indian subcontinent of the desert in the Western tradition, where all the people go to try to figure things out, go away from society. And he studied under, at least according to the tradition, 2 teachers whose names are preserved for posterity. I don't need to go into them. And they taught methods of practice of meditation which were methods of progressive enstasis, going further and further in until one reached, according to their teachings, the still center of the turning world, the Atman or the Brahman or something like that. They didn't use those particular terms. And one of them, after studying on one, the Buddha said, well, that's okay, but it isn't really I got to that, but it isn't the ending of desire, it's just a more subtle state of existence. So there was another teacher who says, oh, I have a much better teaching than that person over there. And he goes, and he says unto him, and the same thing happens. He says, well, yes, it is a more subtle state, but still a subtle state of existence. And it's not the ending of samsara, the ending of cyclic existence. And so he went on to find his own answer. Now, these 2 systems are regarded as something similar to Sankhya Yoga, a form of Hinduism, which says that one goes into that the universe comes out of either a single thing, a one, everything is a one, or it comes out of a combination of 2 things. One is inert matter, and the other is living spirit, which somehow interact. What we need to do to get liberation is to go back into this. This is forms of this are still taught in Hinduism today, and the Buddhist tradition says, but the Buddha tried that and said you hadn't gone far enough. You were good, yes. I mean, not saying you were dumb. You were good, and you got a long way, but you didn't get far enough. And the Buddha saw that you needed to go further than that. So it's okay to practice that, but don't get stuck there. Go further than that. And that is a similar. Buddhism often takes a similar approach to other forms of Hinduism. That it's a good beginning, but it doesn't take you far enough. The Hindu deities are accepted by Buddhism. Sometimes people say there are no gods in Buddhism. Well, there isn't a god in the sense of the Bible or the Quran, as far as I can tell, although the God of the Bible and the Quran is not. It's not easy to understand what that means precisely. I mean, theologians have taught for ages on that, but it doesn't seem to be the same kind of thing. But there are lots of gods and deities, and there's even a supreme deity in Buddhism. But he's not immortal. He only lives for a certain few kind of million years, and then that's the end. The story really is that the smart deities figured out what was going on. When the entity that was to become the Buddha for our continuum left his home and went out in search of the truth, it is said that the deities supported him. In fact, it already had some hand in it, because he wasn't supposed to see that things decayed. He was supposed to be in La La Land, that everything was wonderful all the time, and nobody had any diseases, nobody farted, everything was wonderful. But the deities arranged it that he saw all these things, and then he woke up and said, "Oh, well, then maybe there's more going on than what my father is letting me see here." So the deities had a hand in it because they said, we want to hear the answer. We're stuck in samsara too. We're stuck in suffering. We're not suffering that much. I mean, in the deity realm we have it pretty good. But eventually we die. And then then we become humans, and it's terrible. We won't do that, because we smell, and we have to wash, and we have to, it's terrible. So eat food and stuff. So they support him in this, and then when the Buddha is becoming the Buddha, he says, well, okay, that's it. And they say, oh no, he's not going to teach us. We must do something about this. So they all come down and say, please, there's going to be some people that understand it. Maybe you don't think that many, but there must be some people that understand it. Please teach us. So, okay, he says, all right. Because as soon as you ask a Buddha or a high Lama to teach, a high Buddhist teacher to teach, you activate their compassionate mind, and then they have to teach them out of their compassion. Should be careful of this, because sometimes in the sutras, when Buddha is asked to teach, the preach is for a few thousand years, so you should be all ready to sit for a bit. So he teaches, and the smart deities then convert, in a sense, convert to Buddhism, I don't know. They start to follow the Dharma, and they become protectors of Buddhism. And so a number of the deities are the Hindu deities are found in the pantheon of the Buddhist tradition, and they hang around all the way into Japan. And you'll find in some of the Japanese temples these somewhat odd-looking guys, because they often have guys and women also often have a number of arms and heads, but so do some of the Buddhist things. But they don't look very Japanese. Something different about them. Come from the mysterious West. So, and they're probably Indian. They're Indian deities who have survived. And that's similar. That was a way that the Tibetans approached this also. The first, I think we can call them missionaries to Tibet, even though the word missionary may have a bad feel for you who've been in the hands of a Christian missionary or perhaps a Mormon missionary, but the Buddhist tradition is missionary in the sense that it does go to other countries and proclaim the Dharma, although it's supposed not to go until it's asked. It's not supposed to knock on the door. You're supposed to wait at the door until someone opens it, kind of thing. That's the idea, that you wait until the country asks you to come in, and then you give the teachings. That's the theory. So the first missionaries from the Indian subcontinent to Tibet were rather academic and stayed in a doctrinal sphere, and the people said, well, this is all very interesting, but we can't go along with it, because our local deities would be very annoyed, and they would make nasty things happen. If we go along with you, they're going to destroy us, and our crops won't grow and stuff like that, because the local deities, the Songma, as they're called in Tibetan, the deities of the earth, are going to be upset. So then it was a later missionary called in Sanskrit Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche is called by the Tibetans the precious teacher, and he figured out that what he had to do here was to confront the local deities, and they're taken very seriously. Buddhism does not say your local deities are fantasies. Some traditions will say that, and some parts of the Bible will say you are constructing idols, and they're just fantasies, they're just painted images, and they don't do anything, and you're just deluded by the whole thing. And then some Christians will say they're all devils or something. But the Buddhist tradition takes these guys seriously and says, well, they really exist, but they're not as powerful as the Buddha and as the Dharma. So what we need to do here is to convince them that the Buddha is a better magician. If these local entities are going to do magic tricks, sort of in the way Tim does his tricks in Monty Python and the Holy Grail with throwing thunderbolts everywhere, you know that one? Some who call me Tim. and he's throwing ton of. So we're going to do some magic tricks. You don't see Monty Python? Monty Python and the Holy Grail is the best movie ever made. There's no doubt about it in my mind. And especially if you know the Holy Grail's stories, it's so close, but just a little bit off. That's why it's so funny. So Padmasambhava goes in and he confronts the local deity and he challenges the local deity to a contest. And they throw thunderbolts around and whatever, and he wins. And so it bows down and becomes a Dharmapala, or protector of the Dharma. And the local people say, oh, well, so it's fine now. Our local deity has become Buddhist, so we all become Buddhist too. So that is kept on, so that very often in the Tibetan liturgy there is mention of these local deities of the Sungma, and there is an attempt to relate to them and to hope that they're doing well, and then ask for their protection, because they're more powerful than humans, so they can be asked for our protection, but they cannot lead us to liberation because they themselves are trapped in the cycle of rebirth. And in a similar way, Southeast Asia has adopted a sort of two-step process. It's not as neat as the Tibetan one, but the local entities, let's say in Burma, there are local fertility deities called Nuts. They spell it N-H-A-T in Romanization. And the Nuts are taken very seriously by the Burmese, and they will pay honor to them and make little tree houses for them and so forth, and be very respectful of them, because they are powerful, but they know that the Buddhists are more, that the bhikkhus are more powerful. So as I understand it, and I've not been to Burma, so I haven't seen this actually happening, or what they call now Myanmar, the bhikkhus are able to ignore the shrines to the Nuts, because the Nuts recognize that the bhikkhus are more powerful than they, so the Nuts pay honor to the bhikkhus, to the monks, not the other way around. And a monk apparently can even go in and destroy a shrine of a Nut if he thinks it's not behaving itself or something. We might think that maybe in our culture we've lost a lot of our local deities, but we might ask about spirit of place and so forth that we still hear about from native peoples, and the native peoples that who are called in Canada the first peoples, which I think is an excellent term actually. I think we should use that in our country, call the so-called Red Indian, which is a really bad name, first peoples, because they were here. Yes, they were actually here. Do you know the thing on Firesound Theatre? This is a long time ago. No one listens to Firesound Theatre now. But these Firesound Theatre people, they do the discovery of America. Christopher Columbus comes, and these sort of Indians, Red Indians, come down to the beach, and Christopher Columbus says, "Oh, we've discovered you." And the native people say, "No, we discovered you. We came down to the beach, and there you were." So it depends who discovered who. But we still quite a number of the native peoples or first peoples are very much in touch with the spirit of place, the spirits of place. And in fact, there's a very curious similarity between a lot of the Native American practices and cultures, especially I think of the Pueblos, not of the Plains Indians and the Cherokees. There's between them and the Tibetans. No one quite knows what to do with it, but occasionally it's not been just made up by the white man or white woman. Some Tibetan will be practicing in some city, and the native peoples hear of it and say, "You're doing what our ancestors said someone would come and do. Please come and do ceremonies in our village." And I say, "Oh yeah, that's exactly what they said you would do." Now how does this happen? I don't know. But there's something going on there which we need to look at. But the idea is that we haven't entirely lost this notion of the spirits of the place. And that when we build houses or when we dig or whatever, we should be respectful of all of this. But if we are practicing Buddhism, we say, well, they are maybe powerful, but they're not as powerful as the Buddha. They can only go so far. In China, it all got mixed up, but it's surprising that it did. The entry of Buddhism into China is one of the big success stories. One wouldn't have expected it to happen, because China was the only really high culture, high ancient culture with its own philosophy and religion, its own way of doing things. It knew exactly what was its own totally impenetrable language, and it knew what was going on. And in came this scruffy thing from the West, with people with large round eyes, big noses and beards, and strange looking people. Round eyes, oh, right. So they would ignore it, but somehow the Buddha Dharma was attractive enough to the Chinese that they took it to their hearts, more or less. Never quite. Often there's a suspicion in Chinese history that if something goes wrong, it's the fault of the Buddhists, because they don't worship the ancestors, and they may be foreign and they're traitors and so forth. So, and they may be Korean or something. So it's not too good. But in general, they did go in, and no other non-Chinese religion has ever been able to penetrate to the heart of China as much as Buddhism has. So that in some cases one talks of the three traditions of China, Confucianism, Taoism, and also Buddhism. And once it had gone in, however, there wasn't much interest in keeping it separate from other things. In fact, the whole notion that since we have this term Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, we might immediately jump to the conclusion, three distinct religions. And that's what a lot of the early missionaries did, the Christian missionaries. They made the idea that they got to the idea there was three different religions, and then there was a lot of other stuff which they called folk. They didn't know what to do with that. It was simply a way of speaking that the Chinese developed during the Song dynasty, that there were these three kind of different ways of going about things, of Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha, and they were all friends together, and they had different aspects on things, and they weren't different religions. They were they're depicted sometimes in the art as being three old men. Of course they're old. In China, if you're old, they respect you, right? Three old men who have different views, but they're friends with each other, and they talk about stuff, and they have differences of opinion, but they don't get upset with each other. But they say it's that therefore they are all linked together. The three religions are harmoniously one. 三教合一. But today, when we look at China from a perspective of the academic study of religion, normally now we've tried to get away from that three separate religions concept and look at the practice. Are we looking at a funeral practice, or a marriage, or a wedding practice, or a fortune-telling practice, or what are we looking at? And then we see that Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and folk and whatever is all blended in, so that those categories are not very useful. So if one is a Chinese Buddhist monk or nun, one would be identified as being Buddhist because there'd be Buddhas in the temple, and you look different from others. But you would expect them to have some knowledge of the Tao Te Ching and maybe to have written a commentary on it. The monastery will be arranged on Confucian lines, the way people are, with the abbot at the top as the father and the former abbot as the grandfather and so forth, and the former abbot as the ancestor. And then one would be practicing medicine, hopefully, and that would come out of the Taoist so-called tradition. It's very difficult to find a Chinese who would say, I am Buddhist, or even I am Confucian or Taoist. They say, I am Chinese, and they're doing all this other stuff. And the main preoccupation of the Chinese, when everything is put aside, I think, is long life, immortality. When you go into any Chinese restaurant and show this character for long life is there all over the place. Also Fu blessing and all that, but it's long life. So that, I think that is why devotion to Amitabha Buddha, the Buddha of limitless light and life, is so popular in China. It seems to pick up on that notion. In fact, the person I translated, the 6th century text that I translated for my PhD dissertation, in which I'm now in the process of revising for a popular audience or a non-specialist audience, since it's a wonderful text, but the form of it is rather convoluted, and I'm going to straighten it out and get rid of the footnotes and put it out into for ordinary people to read. At that point, in one of the traditions of the author of the commentary, he's doing a commentary on the commentary on the commentary, but it's a Chinese commentator, and he asks at one point, he's sort of more to the Taoist thing at that point, though he's a Buddhist monk, and he asks the Indian subcontinent missionary Bodhiruchi, what about Buddhism? Do you have anything as good as our immortality stuff that we have in China? And Bodhiruchi spits on the ground in disdain. The Japanese say, he gave a great shout. I said, no, it says tutu, he spit on the ground. He's Chinese. It's in China, it's spit on the ground, right? In Japan you wouldn't do it, but in China you're going to do it. and he said, even if you were to practice this for all your life, you would only get into a long life. You would never get out of rebirth, of samsara. I will give you the scriptures of the greatest immortal, the Da Xian, who will give you the way to get out of beginning and ending of life. Because the problem really is that we're born, you see. I see that we've all been born. That's a problem, according to Buddhism, because we'll have suffering since we have been born. So then, to finish up soon, so we can have some time for questions, Japan was somewhat like the Chinese in mixing things up, but then when push comes to shove, the Japanese don't really like to mix things up. I think of the Japanese mind, and Kay can correct me here if it doesn't work, like a bento, like a lunchbox, that things are in separate divisions. In China, you take your rice and you put your food on the rice. In Japan, you don't do that unless the rice is separate. Unless you have donburi, and I've been told by Japanese that that's extremely Chinese to have donburi when you have the food on top of it. It's a very risky kind of thing to do, to put something on the rice. So everything is divided up into compartments, and so there was an identification of Buddhism and Shinto and Taoism and whatever, but they were allowed to interconnect in some way. But then somebody came up with a very interesting and sophisticated idea, which had a lot of currency in Japan for quite some time, called Honji Shurijaku. Literally, it's the original ground and the following footstep. Honji is the earth, and then on the earth, which is universal, is a footprint. And a footprint is always individual. Every footprint is individual. So this was saying that the local kami, the local deities of Japan, are the particular footprint which is part of this universal thing which is happening throughout the world, which is Buddhist. So the most common one here would be the sun goddess. So Amaterasu, or Omikami, is very Japanese. It's a she, incidentally, to the distress of Jungians. The sun is female and the moon is male. And she is the ancestress of the imperial line, so she's very important and the biggest of the shrines in Japan. The Issei Daijingu is enormous and very well kept. It's a wonderful place. You mustn't miss it if you go to Japan. In comes Buddhism. How will it handle this wonderful tradition? Well, there happened to be a Buddha who is called in Sanskrit Mahavairochana, meaning the big shining one, and then in Chinese, Daji for big sun Buddha, or Dainichibutsu in Japanese. So, big sun goddess. Same thing, yes? But the sun goddess is the local thing, and then it came to be said that the sun goddess prepared Japan for the eventual coming of the Buddha, Mahavairochana, and that the sun goddess and the great sun Buddha were the same entity. So it didn't matter who you worshipped. So you will very often find in a Shinto shrine a little Buddhist thing, and in a Buddhist shrine a little Shinto thing. Now in the US, finishing up here, I've talked a little bit about the native tradition, but most of us, if we're white folks like me, when we have a problem, do we go to a minister, priest, or rabbi? Well, maybe. But if we really want to get to the heart of the problem, we go to a psychotherapist. And we say, do you know of a good therapist? Now, I want a gay one that lives in the Castro and is in my HMO. Oh, yeah, I know Dr. So-and-so. You must try him. He's great. Oh, good. So I think that's our principal concern quite often, especially in San Francisco. I mean, I don't have a therapist at the moment. I used to have one, but I don't have one right now. And so Buddhism and psychotherapy have entered into a very interesting dialogue, in which is similar to the way it's reacted to the other religions in other parts of the world. That Buddhism says, yes, psychotherapy is good. Of course, it isn't always good, but if psychotherapy is done well, and the person knows what they're doing, it's good. But it will only lead you so far. And maybe you need to go into psychotherapy before you come in to Buddhism. Some people come into Buddhism and the teacher says, do so-and-so. The teacher says, jump, and you say, how high? Well, this is not Buddhism. You must trust, you must know that the teacher is really the teacher for you before you can accept him or her. So maybe you haven't developed an ego. When they say give up your ego, maybe you haven't developed one, so you just do whatever and you become a clone. First you have to develop an ego in regular psychotherapy, and then you give it up in Buddhism. And they do different things. This has been remarked by Jack Cornfield and people like that who know what they're doing in all of this. So it's a very similar tradition to all the way back into Hinduism, that these entities, the deities of the San Francisco, which are the psychotherapists in the Castro, can help us to a certain way, and then we need to go further. Okay, I will stop there, and we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yes.
For years I've been trying to find out what is the source for Islamic hostility to Buddhism, which has a long history right up to the present. And in the Kala Chakra Tantra, it specifically mentions Islam as an enemy of Buddhism by name.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you would have. What I'm really looking for is sources to track down the history of this. So if you have any information or comment on that.
The question is, what is the source of hostility between Islam and Buddhism, or Buddhism and Islam? And are there any sources? I don't know of anybody who's working specifically in this field, but it is remarkable that Islam has gone into parts of the world that were Buddhist and was always very successful. All the Buddhism went when Islam came in. So especially Inner Asia, Afghanistan, where there were those large Buddhas until recently that they were finally destroyed by the Muslims. It's surprising to me that they lasted as long as they did. It wasn't a surprise that they went, to me, because the worst thing you can do in Islam is to build an image. And the Buddhists build big ones. I mean, it's just a red rag to a bull. I mean, it's just, you know it's going to be, you know you're in for trouble. And then, so in Inner Asia, and then Indonesia was Muslim, and somehow or other, Buddhism was not able to stand up against Islam. And I don't hold to the view that it was just because the Muslims are more forceful and they come in with the sword in one hand and the Quran in the other and say which you're going to choose. I mean, you're not going to. You might have some success at the beginning in that way, but by coming in with violence like that, you're not going to have a lot of success. It's not going to last for a long time. Something I think our government needs to hear at the moment. So there's obviously this history that Muslims are very dangerous people, and because they can destroy us. And that could be the source of it, but I don't know if anybody was working in this, so I don't know sources. The Kala Chakra is one, but where that comes from, I don't know. Okay, thank you.
I did hear one comment, and that is that Islam offers permanence and a more distinct reality. That is, it looks like it's something that truly exists and has substantial reality, whereas Buddhism offers impermanence and only relative reality. So people who are frightened really are looking for permanence somehow.
Yes. Well, that might be actually when you say frightened. One thing that I didn't get to in my talk, which would be subsidiary to the Honji Suijaku thing, Kobo Daishi, known in his lifetime as Akukai, who is the founder of the tantric form of Buddhism in Japan. He brought it in from China and did an innovative thing by getting two big mandalas and putting them together and making a new tradition out of that. He wrote a very long treatise called The 10 Stages of the Development of Mind, which showed how we went from unreflective stuff to some kinds of religion, to non-Buddhist religions, and then to Buddhist religions, and finally to Tantric Buddhism at the top. He presented this to the emperor, who said, "I can't read this; it's much too long. Can we have a shorter version?" Which he then wrote. This is all Hoyaku, the precious key to the secret treasury, and there after the first level, which is the level of the goat, the person with only an idea of survival. The other two levels are Confucianism and then Taoism and Hinduism, where one is trusting in a higher power, like a deity, and hoping to go to heaven. And this is called the level of the Confucian level, who's a person who's extremely moral, doesn't have any higher power, is called at this level of the innocent a child. And then the next one, who trusts in a God and will go to heaven, is the fearless a child. The one who is like, Corless says, is like the calf who follows its mother. So there is a sense there that Buddhism would say, yes, if all you know about is some kind of deity who's going to protect you, it's like a child who says, "But I want my mommy."
Dogma versus uncertainty.
Comments. I like the description of the U.S. having the religion of the psychotherapy. It kind of sounds right to me. I come from Sweden. And, one of the things is, which I noticed very much, which is a big difference, I think, is that people don't really listen very much in the U.S. And I find that the Buddhist practices and Buddhism kind of enables people to listen more than just speaking, more than just having a narrow mind and just going in one direction. But it's also interesting to see that the U.S. was built on a lot of people with a lot of different directions being very narrow-minded, and because it can create a lot of things. If you have enough people, then they can do their thing. The question is how you get them to listen to each other. And another interesting thing with all this is I've never been in a country where people demand respect from other people, but they never give any themselves. It's a very interesting concept, but I think Buddhism will help a lot there for people to look inside.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I don't think I'll comment on that, but I will pick up the certainty thing, because it was much in my mind. The place I rented, I was just in Hawaii last month to start this revision of my PhD dissertation. I rented this little cottage in the woods in the rainforest on a 12-volt battery and all that kind of thing. It was really rustic. And the owners, well, not the owners actually, the renters, the owners from New Jersey, but the people who were looking after it, the landlords, were a Japanese couple who had converted to Jesus, and I don't mean to Christianity, but to Jesus, a very sort of fundamentalist one. And because, she said, when my mother died, the Buddhist priest could only say, "Well, we don't know what's happened to your mother, but we have to say prayers after 49 days, and we hope for the best." And she said, "But I know I'm going to Jesus. Jesus will save me." You see, so she converted because of this notion of it's certain. And when I said, "Well, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what I'm doing," he said, "Well, that's no problem."
Well, thank you.
Any more questions, or are we out of time? Yes. As Christmas Humphreys used to say in England, "Now by the illusion of time." Thank you.
It is impatient.
I'll be going to lunch with people. I have to talk to Jim about the GBF retreat, but I'll certainly be around so we can talk a bit.
Thank you.
If you like. Yes.
Time for announcements.
There are snacks out there on the table and tea. Please help yourselves. There are also mice, Buddhist mice. But please wait if you sprinkle crumbs or drop crumbs and cookies on the floor or something like that. Please pick them up rather than offering them to our poor-living friends. There is a diamond bowl for your contributions, or whatever you want to offer. It's just wonderful, but we've always suggested $5 to $20 because we do have a lot of costs associated with GBF. And the literature will be out there. If somebody knows where it is, I hated to look through all over the door trying to find it. Copies of the book, any other. Well, there may or may not be literature out there. If this is your first visit and you want to
some materials there.
Yes, the GBF annual retreat will take place on September 24th to 26th. It's a weekend, Friday through Sunday. And Corless and Jim Wilson will be our teachers this year again. So if you're interested, please pick up the registration form outside. Thank you.
And the topic will be the 5 precepts, which include sex, of course. So that's we're not going to try to we don't want to emphasize that, but we have to mention it somewhere.
Nice trailer. I'll be there.
Showing the most sensational.
Yes, definitely. And anyone here for the first time? Welcome. Again, you are Charles. Great. From where? From Oh, you want to? Welcome. Good to have you this day. Let's see, did I miss anything? Got it all. Then if we could stand in a circle, take one another's hands. And Roger, offer a blessing for us.
Oh, the floor gets further away the older I get. By the merits of this practice, may all beings be separated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings be joined to happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings dwell in equanimity with those who are near and those who are far. And may all beings find peace, joy, and freedom. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.